Okay, it's just gone 6:30, so I think we should start. So filming at meetings, I don't think this meeting's being filmed. It is so, yeah, just to remind everybody that this meeting is being filmed, and apologies for absence. I've got apologies for lateness from Councillor Carroll.
I've had apologies from Councillor Ringett and Councillor Newton. Councillor Carter substituting.
Item 3, any items of urgent business, not that I know of.
There's none, Chair.
Any declarations of interest? None. Any deputations, petitions or presentations? None. So that moves us to the minutes of the 7th of November meeting, which are on pages 1 to 6. Councillor Bevan.
Can I ask for an update on page 3 at the issue with Thames Water and the court case with another council, whether it has any implications for Homes for Haringey?
Is there anyone that can? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we're still looking at the Thames Water case and our Thames Water contract. The legal advice we have at the moment is, I think as I said at the last meeting, that the decision that was wrong, that was taken was wrong, and there's a test case, I understand, about to take place shortly to challenge that decision.
Councillor Carter.
Thank you, Chair. Should I mention now that I'm a substitute for Councillors Engert and Newton?
That's fine, yeah, that would be great. I know you normally attend these anyway, so... So are those minutes agreed? Okay, that moves us on to the minutes of the 19th of December, which are on pages 7 to 16.
It's just related to Broadwater Farm. I think what I've read and from the minutes and what we've heard and some briefings from Alan Strickland, that you've done a very good job at Broadwater Farm. And I really wanted to ask you what lessons you think you'd learned from that experience about engagement with residents.
So I think what we've learned from that experience is the importance of engaging with not only the residents but community leaders, doing that early and making sure we keep everyone informed on a regular basis, whether it be through letter, public meetings, having drop-in sessions. Working closely with the community, I think, is what has led that to being so successful in the way that's moved forward.
Okay, are those minutes agreed, or are there any more questions? Okay, that's agreed. I think I didn't do this earlier, but I noticed Councillor Carroll has just come in. There may be some people here who don't know each other, so maybe we should just go around and introduce ourselves. So I'm Mina Ibrahim and I'm the chair of this panel.
Councillor Carroll, Taunton Hill.
Councillor Anne Waters, Woodside. Zena Brabazon, Haringey Ward.
Clive Carter, Highgate Ward.
Councillor John Bevan, Northumberland Park.
Dan Hawthorne, Director of Housing and Growth.
Chris Sliffen, Interim Managing Director of Homes for Haringey.
Jill Taylor, the Housing Support Transformation Manager.
Alan Benson, Head of Housing.
Fred Nugent, Development Enabling Manager.
Matthew Patterson, Head of Strategic Planning.
Emma Williamson, Assistant Director for Planning.
Philip Slover, I'm the Clerk.
Okay, thank you everyone. So that moves us on to item 8, which is housing related support for older people, which is pages 17 to 30.
Thank you, Councillor. Are we going to use the screen or just the papers? Thank you. Will this work? Whilst we'll wait for that, I can sort of just start, I guess. My name's Jill. I was previously employed by Haringey to conduct the Supported Housing Review, which was approved by Cabinet in March of last year. So I'm here really today to give a bit of an update on some of the work that's been happening with older people's services. So I'll start with a recap for those people who either don't remember or haven't been involved in that before. Thank you. I've got this. So, thank you. So, oh, is that better? Yeah. Thanks. So for anyone who doesn't know or isn't exactly clear, housing-related support is support that's offered to people who might have a range of different vulnerabilities, and what it's not is care. So it includes things like sheltered housing, hostels for homeless people, foyers for young people, etc. And we commission about 2,000 units of sheltered housing for older people in the borough, and the majority of those are provided by Homes for Haringey. We also commission, as part of the housing-related support work for older people, the community alarm service and also floating support that goes into people's homes. So when we're talking for the rest of this presentation, we're not talking about residential care homes or nursing homes. So just to make that a bit clear. So as I just mentioned, the Supported Housing Review concluded in March of 2017, was approved by Cabinet. And principally what was approved was a set of recommendations and some guiding principles about how those recommendations would be implemented. The Supported Housing Review was a joint project between adults and housing, so it reported into P5 and into P2. And its ultimate purpose was to look at both the buildings that we use and the environments that supported housing is provided in, and also the supply and demand data that we had available, and whether or not the services that we commissioned are providing what people need and generating the outcomes that we want. The outcome of the review was the Housing Support Transformation Framework, which is essentially a 5-year strategy about how we will implement the recommendations of the review. And there are 3 specific recommendations within that that relate directly to older people. So this is a lot of information, but it's the recap of the findings of the review. And I guess the sort of key takeaways from that is that older people's supported housing is in lower demand than it has been previously. And what that means is that we are offering the sheltered housing tenancies to younger people, whereas in the past it was to older people, and it's meeting different types of needs. So we're also accommodating people with learning difficulties in our sheltered housing properties, and there's a portion of the sheltered housing properties which have been allocated to adult social care for people leaving hospital. We know that the reason for that is because people previously were moving into sheltered housing much younger and their lives weren't extending as long, and now people are choosing to remain in their tenancies or their other homes for much longer, and what we're seeing then is a higher demand for things like extra care and residential care, which is when people are leaving their homes. And there's a changing picture of needs, so there's a lot of older people who have learning disabilities, whereas in the past people with learning disabilities didn't typically live into older age. So there's a bit of a changing picture of the sorts of needs that people present with, and that's something that we want to address as part of the transformation. We also found that residents want more opportunities to build peer relationships with each other, to do more interesting activities. They said that they were sometimes quite bored with some of the activities that were available and they wanted more interesting things to do, which I think is related to the fact that it's a much broader demographic of people we're supporting with different kinds of needs and experiences in their life. And we found that there's different types of support that's being offered in the different properties. So in some schemes, lots was going on, and in others, very little was going on. And that generally we were finding that a lot of the communal spaces in our sheltered housing properties were underused, and some not used at all, and that seemed like a bit of a wasted opportunity. So we also found that part of the reason for that was that a lot of the schemes and the communal spaces weren't as accessible as they could be, and weren't open as often as the older people wanted them to be, or at times when they wanted them to be. And we also found that there was quite high void rates, and quite a lot of time was being taken around like maintenance and things like that, which was a big problem for the people who are living in sheltered housing, and that's across the board. So that includes the voluntary sector things that services that we commission, as well as the Homes for Haringey provision. We also found that a lot of older people felt that they had a lot of skills that they wanted to offer, as opposed to just feeling like recipients of support. They also wanted to be able to be more engaged in the services that they were actually living in, and to do more with the community that they were part of. So the 4 principles that you can see here were the ones approved by Cabinet, which are to guide the implementation of the recommendations of the review. And that was in recognition of the need for prevention, so preventing people from going into hospital unnecessarily, preventing people from moving into residential care too soon if in fact we were able to support them better in their homes, and to prevent homelessness, and to address those things as well when they come up. Community inclusion is, as it sounds, about giving people opportunities to reduce feelings of isolation and loneliness, and I think since the Cabinet approved those recommendations, there's been an awful lot more research actually about the impact of loneliness on health, so that's actually, it was kind of useful that we had that there at the time. What we wanted to do was to integrate more fully support and care, so where people did have care needs but they were perhaps living in sheltered housing, making sure that that care was going into people's homes at the right times, and we weren't waiting for people to be in any form of health or housing crisis before we were actually offering them what they needed. And securing better value for that, so looking at how we can develop better partnerships. And then the final one is commissioning for the future. So that's looking at maximising the reach of the resources that the Council has. We're very lucky to have the number of sheltered housing properties in the borough that we do. And so it's about making sure that for older people that we're maximising those buildings and the support that we have available, and that we're trying to collaborate with lots of different types of people who are specialists in their field to deliver that for the Council and for the tenants. So the 3 recommendations that relate specifically to older people are there on the left. The first one is the sort of major piece of work around reconfiguring the Homes for Haringey sheltered housing service, and that was is what's been called a hub and cluster model. So thinking about regenerating and reinvigorating the communal spaces and creating hubs where different activities are taking place, and embedding more partnership working happening in those places so that people had somewhere really vibrant to go. And that's partly in recognition that we already had this model of sheltered housing and community good neighbour schemes, and kind of making that a little bit more solid and having a support model around that rather than it being accidental. The next one is about committing to building 200 units of extra care provision, in recognition of the changing pattern of need in the borough, and a sort of understanding that people living longer would need extra levels of care and support as they got older. And then the final one is to increase the availability of floating support and sort of community support for older people to ensure that people could live in their homes for longer if they wanted to, and that it didn't just rely on living in sheltered housing to be able to access support for older people. And you can see on the right that we're making quite good progress. I just want to highlight, we will go into more detail about this in some of the later slides, but I just wanted to highlight the on hold for extra care. And the reason for that is because at the time of the 200 units figure, we were sort of working on the basis of not particularly full information about what the picture of need was, and we were using projections based on various different information that we did have. And we now have a bit of a fuller picture about that, and because we have access to different sorts of information. So it's on hold because we're trying to get a really clear, exact figure about what we need in the borough before we start thinking about building new properties. And that partly comes out of the learning that we've had from Prothero House and Lorenco House, making sure that we build things that we need and that are suitable for purpose. So just to sort of point that out. This slide shows some of the recommendations that are universal, so apply to all the client groups, which includes older people. So just to highlight there that one of the things that we did, and particularly we did with Homes for Haringey Sheltered Housing Tenants, was to develop a supported housing tenants charter. And the purpose of that document is to explain to people who might be affected by any changes in the transformation what they can expect from us, and what they could expect if they were part of that process. And that includes things like how we will work with tenants themselves to develop new ideas and how involved they can be in some of those processes. So that was, I think, quite a good piece of work. I was quite pleased with it. And it was, I think, approved by Cabinet in January of this year. The other three on that slide relate to generally making sure that we're embedding the narrative of building specialist housing for people with particular vulnerabilities every time we build new housing. So not just thinking about building supported housing in isolation, but as part of all of the communities and all of the housing projects that we have. There's also a recommendation around improving the data that we have about people, because we collect quite a lot of data in the council. But about supported housing, perhaps we realised through the review that we weren't collecting all of the data that we actually needed, and we were collecting some things that we didn't. So we're doing some work around making sure that we're monitoring the right information, that we're collecting data, and that we're keeping that data safe. And then the final one was about building on the LGBT history in Haringey, and particularly in recognition that a lot of the older people who were living in sheltered housing at the time, when they were younger, they were unable to be proud about their sexuality or their gender identity, and that results in feeling less able to be open and less able to be honest about some of the support needs they might have in later life. So as part of that, we've commissioned Opening Doors London, who are a specialist older people's LGBT organisation, to go into our sheltered housing services and do some very positive activities with people from all communities, but with a focus and centering around LGBT identities. So we're really pleased that that will be starting soon. Okay, so to go into a bit of detail about the hub and cluster model as it's being called, which is the phrase that we're using for the Homes for Haringey sheltered housing service as was. So the aim of the model is to bring about sort of more activity and more vibrancy to the sheltered housing services that we offer, and to really sort of focus the work that happens in sheltered housing around health and well-being, in recognition of that being the predominant needs that older people present to us with, and the things that they said to us they wanted to see more of in services. What we want those hubs to do is to offer a range of different things. So it might be sort of informal activities and social activities, but it is also about bringing in things like chiropodists and health practitioners who they might have to otherwise travel quite far to go, to bring them into those hub services to give people more localised access to the things that they need. So as part of that work, Homes for Haringey have developed 8 hub services, and there's 4 in the east and 4 in the west. And around each hub there is around between 3 and 6 cluster services, as they're called. And what that broadly means is there will be 8 services which will be staffed Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 all week, and the cluster services will all be attached to that. So they will go and do activities at that hub, they will have access to staff at that hub, and staff will visit the cluster services as opposed to being based there. Which is broadly, again, in line with the kind of sheltered housing, good neighbour model that existed already, but formalising that a bit more. All of the services or service users will continue to have access to the community alarm service, which means they get a welfare call every day, and it means that if they have any problems or anything happens, they're able to access a response from the local authority. So as part of the development of the hub services, we've already started to build some new partnerships. So the local area coordinators, which are a public health initiative, have already started embedding themselves in the hub services in those areas. We've commissioned opening doors, as I've said. We work very closely with Jackson's Lane Theatre, who do a lot of different sort of cultural and arts projects in the sheltered housing schemes, including something called Broadway Brunch, which is extremely popular. And at the moment, I guess it's fair to say that we're very much in the implementation stage. This is not finished or done. There's definitely lots of work ongoing. Homes for Haringey have now recruited all of the staff that they're looking for. So the next stage is to start embedding all of the partnerships and reaching out to different organisations. And one of the things that we're hoping is, because we have this space available in sheltered housing, that's actually a really attractive offer for different organisations who might want to come and do things with our older people. So some of the things that are in progress around that, Homes for Haringey are in the process of completing a £1.3 million improvement programme at Larkspur Close. If anyone has been to visit it, the properties there look really, really good. There's a lot of scaffolding up at the moment, which is safe to say not making people very happy. But when it's gone, there will be much nicer flats that are in place, and the people that I spoke to were quite really happy that it was happening. We've started some work on a trailblazer intergenerational supported housing service, so for older people and young parents. And what we're hoping to do with that is to build on lots of the recent research around the benefits of intergenerational relationships, and as a way of making sure that we are able to support two very vulnerable groups of people who are quite socially isolated to come together and build relationships in a supported housing service. We're also considering at the moment how we might specify a sheltered housing scheme, particularly for older people with learning disabilities, because we recognise that that is a need, but also at the moment people with learning disabilities living in sheltered housing are dotted around in different places, which means that the support they get isn't necessarily consistent or intentional, so there's something we could do around that to support that group of people. We're just also in the process of working out some new protocols around older people leaving hospital who need quite short-term accommodation before they can return to their homes, which is normally for a period of about between 6 weeks and 3 months, sometimes whilst adaptations are being made to their houses, but also sometimes just whilst they're getting a little bit better and need a bit more support before they go home. And then there is work, just as we're just starting to talk about further asset appraisal work, which is based around the 200 units of extra care that we need, and whether or not there are properties within the sheltered housing portfolio that would be suitable to become a service which provided a higher level of support and care. And then my final slide. We continue to work with the co-production group of Homes for Haringey tenants. So it's a group of about 10 sheltered housing residents who are meeting every month at the moment, who are sort of supporting us with this work, and who are challenging us on this work as well, it's safe to say. And they've been really helpful in sort of talking about some of the problems so far in the implementation, some of their ideas about what could change and what could happen in the future. The members working group who started working with me in this supported housing review have continued to support the housing transformation programme. So we've been meeting regularly to talk about what I've been doing and to get their steer on what's happening in the areas that they're representing. The community alarm service is also now under review as part of a broader piece of work we're doing about assistive technologies in the council, which has been really helpful in understanding what it is that people want from the types of alarms or technologies that are in their homes and how that can help people to remain independent for longer. And what we're hoping to get out of that is a kind of menu of different things that people could choose from, so that when they need a community alarm, they're able to select the aspects of that support that they need for themselves. And then we are also in the process of designing a future operating model for the externally commissioned services. So that's the 600 units of sheltered housing that we commission with partners in the borough. And we're looking at what we would like that model to be, how it might fit with the hub and cluster model that we've developed with Home for Haringey. And those contracts do come to an end in January. So we'll be doing that commissioning work starting in the summer. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions? So I'll start with Councillor Waters.
Can I ask a bit about the hub proposal? Are hubs in sheltered housing sort of, is that what they are? I'm imagining that and just wanted to be clear. If you could expand and how you get people from the clusters into the hubs.
Absolutely. Yes, so the hubs are existing sheltered housing services. We've chosen buildings which already lend themselves to that purpose, so they might have larger communal spaces, they might have a sort of kitchen, things like that. We've chosen buildings that are all wheelchair accessible so that more people can attend, and we've tried to centre the hubs sort of like one that's in the middle of a group of other services so that they're not, I think we've said something like there's never any more than a half a mile from the hub to a cluster service, although that's not an exact science. And already what was happening with different schemes was that we were sort of facilitating people going to meetings and activities at different services anyway, so we're kind of being a little bit more concerted about that. And the hub managers, there's a hub manager in each hub, and they're responsible for making sure that all of the tenants in all of the cluster services know about things that are happening, that they know how to maybe get to different places, and also because the hubs will have more staff support, that when we're thinking about offering new tenants, new properties, that we are encouraging people who have perhaps a higher level of support need to live in a hub service where they'll have more access to staff, and people that are perhaps more independent or a bit younger might live in the cluster services because that's more accessible for them to travel around on transport and things like that. Is that helpful? Thank you.
Question, just as a follow-up from that. So presumably if it's a hub, then it would have some kind of service for people who have some level of need but are in general needs. So perhaps to allow them to continue living in general needs accommodation. So how would you kind of, make sure that those people who are not in supported housing can get to them? Because I think that's quite important considering we're getting rid of so many day services.
Definitely, thank you. So yeah, one of the key things which I didn't mention was that the purpose of the hub was to be more of a community space. We did a piece of work when we were setting up Lorenco House and Prothero House around how many people who are of the sort of eligible age live in the surrounding area. It was very clear that there was actually many people living around all of our sheltered housing projects who, in theory, are eligible to access the services there. So what we're working out at the moment is how do we send them letters because they're our tenants and let them know about things that are happening? Are there ways that we can sort of publicise the things that we're doing on our websites for the older people who use the internet? And there's also something in being sort of there's a lot of notice boards outside those, outside our shelter schemes, and using those more assertively to say, come in, we want to do things. Also using things like local doctors' surgeries, put like posters up and stuff like that. But we haven't got a fully formed plan about that, how that will work yet. We're thinking that one of the ways it might happen would be that because we're bringing in partner agencies that people might be working with or visiting already, that we could also use the networks that partner agencies have to sort of promote the different things that are available.
So Zena, next.
A few questions. Can I just follow up on this hub and spoke model? I just was going to follow on Amina's point. Are you doing any, presumably these hubs are open to anyone. You don't have to be a tenant. No. So how do you do, so are you having an outreach program? You talked about an outreach program because, for example, we have got a big gap in, if you like, the building-based elements of adult social care. So I would be curious to know how you're linking up with adult social care to make, so we've been highly criticised for closing all this stuff down. So if these are being developed and they're all over the borough and they're like the community rooms, then presumably you're offering programmes of day activities. I guess that's really what you're talking about, is that right? So how are you going to make sure that people will know about it, who would appreciate that, who are very lonely? Are you working with adult social care? That's my first question. Shall I carry on, or do you want to answer that first? Okay.
Thank you. Yes, we are. I guess what the hubs won't be is a replacement for day services, in that we won't, they're not providing sort of the level of social care that day centres were providing. That said, there's not a reason why there might not be ways in which some of those needs and services couldn't be incorporated into that. And we're equally thinking about even broader than that, for example, things like having play groups for creche in some of the schemes, again, recognising this intergenerational thing and thinking about how do we make them a more community space. And in terms of asking about outreach programmes, one of the things we're looking at when we recommission the housing-related support for older people that we fund in the community is actually, is there a better way of doing that? And actually, is that more of an outreach function where we are actively going and meeting older people in the various places that we know they go or in their homes to try and encourage that to happen in a bit more of a sort of coordinated way? And the local area coordination model is quite helpful for us in learning from that. Sort of how do we make sure that people know about all of the things that are happening in their areas and stuff?
I'm quite a creative person when things like that, because I used to, many years ago, as development officer, developing things. Would you work with organisations like the U3A or the WEA and bring in all these external things which are available? Haringey has its own U3A, for example, and it isn't all about Italian and Latino and high art. It has to be about lots of things. So instead of lowering the bar, to raise the bar and use them as much more creative settings seems to me a really good idea. Can I go on? You talked about voids. Do you have a high rate? I'm not quite clear. Is there a high rate of voids in sheltered housing?
Yes, is the short answer. There is a high rate of voids across sheltered housing, so Homes for Haringey, but also in our voluntary sector commission services. We're not entirely clear. I mean, I guess the reason that we have come to understand from that is seeing a demand spike at the higher end of the need for services, so extra care and residential care. There seems to be a sort of shift in the way that older people are using sheltered housing now. In the past, it was very much a kind of default. As you got older, you would move into sheltered housing, whereas now people are moving out of the city, so there is a different relationship with sheltered housing in the borough. And also there's people are moving into it later. We're seeing that the age of application is later than it used to be.
Give us a critical insight from your experience of whether there is enough interaction with the housing people for people who might benefit from sheltered housing, who aren't being offered it or being directed to it, who could benefit. And I'm thinking of some, Amina and I are in the same ward, and we've had some cases where sheltered, for example, would have really been a great solution, and all people were told was, well, you're in band C, so you're not going to get anything. And that sort of more lateral thinking, whether work is being done with housing officers to think about how that could be extended. You know, people who've got disabilities who would benefit and who are in private sector renting, costing a fortune. You think exactly what I'm thinking about.
Just clarify that, because I think that's an important point, actually, because I think the particular experiences we had is kind of because of the way sheltered housing is, it's generally always a one-bedroom, okay? And obviously there are people who would benefit perhaps from support in sheltered housing but would need a two-bedroom because, I mean, that's the case that we're thinking of. But is there a demand for bigger sheltered accommodation, simply because, I mean, when we did this, it was last year, I remember we went and visited some schemes, and they are a lot of what was kind of built in the past are quite small, and obviously for people who used to living in, you know, kind of larger accommodation, it can be quite a shock. And I think I think it's a little bit to do with the way sheltered housing is seen and the way it actually is as to why we probably have less people wanting to move into it. Do you not? That's not really a question, that's a statement, but.
So I think, both those points are quite relevant, really. The voids in the supported housing schemes are hard to let. We're finding it more and more difficult to let them. They are small properties, and there are some of our residents who are in 2-bedroom properties, possibly 3-bedroom properties, where people from within those properties would benefit from support. And obviously, trying to match those people with properties from amongst our current stock is almost impossible. So there is a potential need for some larger properties. But certainly our 1-beds at the moment are hard to let, even though our housing officers and particularly our temporary accommodation team do a lot of work once we get one of the properties void to try and do matching from amongst our temporary accommodation or amongst our residents with 1-bed properties.
Would you think that... Sorry.
Anybody else that wants to ask a question other than Zena? Did you have your hands up? Yep. I'll come back to you, Zena. It's fine.
Thank you, Chair. It's a very small question. What, please, is a step-down property?
Thank you. Sorry. So a step-down property is a step down from hospital. Normally, that's how we see it, or from other form of quite high-level support or care. So it might be a person needs a period of time in a step-down property, which is the same as any other sheltered. It's just a sheltered housing unit, but we've allocated it specifically for the purpose of being short-term, as opposed to being a lifetime tenancy, which is what the other sheltered housing scheme units are. So it's sort of an intermediary form of housing for people who might need a bit of extra support, or even a lot of extra support before they either move back home or before they move to somewhere else, which is considered their kind of housing solution. Does that make sense? Sorry.
And Councillor Waters and then Councillor Brabazon. Trying to be equitable.
The Good Neighbour schemes, do they still exist? And do they, as it were, work? Since I have a couple in my ward, one of which has more sort of tenant strife than any other part of the ward. So I just wonder whether Good Neighbour schemes work.
I think it's safe to say that in recent years, Good Neighbour schemes, their original intention was in quite a different time in the world, and when the way of living was quite different. But in effect, over the last sort of 10 years, what they've really become is just general needs properties that are allocated for older people, which works quite well in some respects, in that they're often, the people who lived there were often older people with some support needs, but much lower. And perhaps really all they needed was just not to live next door to a family for some reason that they felt. So in that sense, they worked. But actually, I think, given what we know now about sort of demand and about older people and what they've said to us, I think we could use those, we are trying to use those properties in a bit more of an intelligent way, so as to make sure the people that were living there were actually able to address some of those, the needs they had, or to build those peer relationships, or to move away from some of the tenant issues they might have had elsewhere.
Okay, I'll now come back to Councillor Brabazon.
I'm very interested in what you're saying, and it's just stimulated a lot of thoughts, really, which I hope is the point of this communication across this very wide divide. It always reminds me of Citizen Kane, you know.
I think next time people should just scatter around.
Yeah.
Don't have to sit opposite
If
each
there are
other.
voids, that opens up the opportunity for thinking about, well, what do we do with these properties? If they're small, I know you can't make policy on one case, but that experience of these people in private sector renting and they needed 2 bedrooms would suggest, if your couples are living longer and somebody's disabled, should we knock some of them about and make them bigger? That's one question. The other thing is, I don't know whether you heard a report on the radio the other day, which was about different ways of tackling homelessness. And this one was in Anglesey. And I know we're not in Anglesey, but it was extremely interesting. What they did, they said housing first. That was their policy. They would house homeless people first, then deal with the problems. They stabilised people who were living on the streets in housing. Now, if we've got voids and we have sheltered housing that no one really wants, that raises the question, well, would that be a possible thing to do with homelessness, people single homeless, people living on the street? In our ward, people are sleeping under the bridge, thinking about these things in a very different way. I'm not saying, I know you shouldn't reach to solutions in a committee and all of that, but there's very little opportunity to have dialogue with officers. And actually, what you've said, if we have void properties, housing that no one's living in, then we should be thinking in as wide a range as possible, it seems to me, about how we deal with that. So that's my next point. And the one other thing I wanted to ask you was, you say here you need 200 extra care because that's people living longer and so on. So does extra care fit in the housing targets?
Okay, thank you. So to address the sort of a little bit the conversions bit, but Chris will take that from me. Actually, perhaps because of, well, so we have some two-bedroom sheltered housing properties, and they're actually our hardest to let. Now, partly that's because some of them that I'm thinking of particularly are in Campbell Court, which is a tower block. So there's quite specific reasons why people don't want to live in a tower block. But there are some, but they are hard to let. There is equally at Prothero House and Lorenco House, the two-bedroom units were the hardest to let, despite the fact that they're beautiful and huge and have a garden and all of the, you know, in theory, the things which would make them more attractive to people. So I think there's something for us in thinking about what we could do with some of the units that we have, but also it might not be that it's bigger units that we actually need. I think we had a lot of conversation in Supported Housing Review about that offer, the downsizing offer. What is it that people would need to want to move out of a 2 or 3 bedroom house into a 1 bedroom flat? Mm-hmm. And it's not just about size, but it's definitely about size. It's also about the other things they feel perhaps help with moving and all of that. And I know that Homes for Haringey have done quite a lot of work about thinking about that and trying to incentivise that. But there is something around that which doesn't quite fit. To talk about housing first, so we do commission housing first in the borough already for homeless people, and just as you mentioned, it's really successful. It's one of our most successful services. It works with people with really, really complex experiences and histories and really helps them to stabilise before they start to address their issues. Yeah, exactly. And just as you suggested, we are exactly thinking about how do we use sheltered housing properties differently if we're finding that older people aren't wanting to live in them, but at the same time we know there's lots of other groups of people who really would benefit from the support that's available there, which is where the idea for the intergenerational supported housing service came from, because we know that we have quite a small number, but a number of young parents who live in our temporary accommodation who would actually really benefit from being in a supported environment, and perhaps the expertise that older people have around parenting and intergenerational relationships. A lot of our young parents who are homeless come from care backgrounds, and so they don't have a grandparent or someone like that. So there's something in supporting people to build those relationships, and actually what our responsibility is in doing that. So I'm really pleased that you said we should do that, because that's kind of what we hope to do.
Rowland Hill Nursery School, which I know intimately, there was a very good link with Larkspur Close and using the community garden. Now, I see Larkspur's up for a refurb. I think it would be quite good to revive that, because the older people got a lot from, they do those relationships and the people telling their stories and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of evidence that these things really do work. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that they're doing, as well as redeveloping the flats in Larkspur Close, is to spend some money as well on that communal space to make it a bit nicer and brighter, so actually it would be perfect for that. Thank you, I will.
So, I mean, I don't know if anybody's got any more questions, but I was just going to, obviously, talking about because I think that's a big question about why somebody in a 2-3 bedroom who's, under occupying would move in to some of our properties, because I've seen them. I mean, for example, Larkspur Close, I've been there. I know, and I thought you might be asking a question on that, Councillor Bevan, because I probably agree with you, and because I obviously know Councillor Ball's got a strong commitment to Larkspur Close, but I thought there were issues with it when I last saw it, but it was a while ago. What would incentivise somebody to move from a 2-3 bedroom, which we could then re-let to families? And I think from knowing kind of something about how communities work in Haringey, the particular cultural dynamics and the networks, is what about looking at, if we are going to invest in new schemes, which you spoke about earlier, looking at placing them within existing estates? Because I think what one of the biggest blocks for people moving away is, and for a lot of people, moving from Tottenham to Muswell Hill is the other side of the universe. It's not about moving outside of Haringey. I mean, for most people, that isn't an option, because that's not where their networks are. That's not where they're used to going to the shops, where they've got their kind of systems in place. Because I know from our ward, the reason why we've got still, to this day, got a very large elderly Greek Cypriot community is because of access. Actually, you can just walk down to the bottom of the road on all of the ladder roads, and you can live independently for quite a long time. And we notice that when we do a lot of door knocking, that's the reason why people want to stay there for as long as possible, simply because it's where their friends are, where their shops are, where they can buy their food, etc. So maybe thinking about building or reconfiguring existing properties that we have in areas that people want to stay in, and that's where I think people will more likely move from a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom into a 1-bed if they're actually not going very far.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And what we see is that people who lived in Tottenham stay in Tottenham in sheltered housing. Our sheltered housing schemes that are on the ladder are predominantly Greek Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot people. And we have other services as well, which are accidentally, because actually anybody could live anywhere, but people choose to live in the places and the communities where they were themselves raised or where they lived. So I think you're absolutely right. If we're going, and also I think it's probably fair to say that whether or not we think our sheltered housing properties are very nice, people actually feel very committed to them as sheltered housing scheme in that area. So if we were going to redevelop or reconfigure or whatever it is, a particular sheltered housing scheme to support other people, we should absolutely do that where it is and make sure that it retains its identity as an older people's sheltered housing service, but maybe looks different or maybe works with a slightly different group of people. We're very lucky because our sheltered housing schemes are scattered all over the borough, so we actually have more or less, we have a couple of schemes in every ward, more or less, which means that for the most part people do get to stay where they want to, or they move just slightly further away if that's what they want as well. But I think you're relating to your point about Larkspur Close. One of the things that the review was very clear about was that there is a really significant disparity between some of the schemes. Some of them are beautiful, the facilities are excellent, because they were all built at different times, and some of them, Larkspur Close being an example of that at the time, has been earmarked many times, as Councillor Bull would attest if he was here, to either be closed or to be knocked down or to be sold or to be something else, because whether we love it or not, and whether we feel there's a strong sense of community around it, it wasn't appropriate. The building quality had become poorer and poorer and poorer, which is why the redevelopment programme, the improvement programme that's taking place now is actually such a large sum of money, because it's changing the roofs, it's doing all of the bathrooms, it's opening up the window spaces, it's making kitchens, exactly, and they're much lighter now. I was really, yeah, they're dark and they feel horrible. I wouldn't want to live there, and that's my sort of take on it. Exactly. But in visiting it, I was really impressed, and I'm definitely not a sort of advocate for Larkspur Close in that sense, but in seeing it now, it is really improved, and in terms of the way that they are looking at the roofs and the windows, it will have a tangible impact on things like people's energy bills, whether or not there's damp, all of that kind of thing will be addressed by that programme. So it was kind of a way of addressing people's really strong feelings around the service should continue, and they wanted to live there, and that they felt that it was an important place, but at the same time trying to do something to make the buildings better. And it's a funny site, so in terms of building something new on it, it was deemed not to really be very appropriate to do that because it has a little brook that runs behind it, and it's actually a funny shape, so building something new is a little bit more difficult than it perhaps had been sort of seen to be in the past. So I think we've kind of got a good halfway. So yeah.
A final question about looking at 2 beds, because I don't want to go into the specific, I know you've got your hand up, but I mean, in terms of people are having children older, so for example, the case that we're thinking, it's because the family, there is an under 16-year-old, so obviously it would need to be a 2-bed. So have you not thought about those types of scenarios where perhaps, so somewhere like, a property where you've got voids that are 1 beds, next, kind of moving people within the scheme, but then knocking through properties to make them larger, perhaps?
So we have considered the option of changing the layout of some of the properties and knocking through. That does rely on 2 properties becoming vacant next to each other or decanting someone. Yeah, so decanting someone to do it. The problem around, I would say, the problem around sheltered housing being hard to let, or supported housing being hard to let, has probably come up in the last year. So it's not something that's long-standing, and it's something that we're looking at a whole range of options, including changing the age mix of people within the schemes, perhaps knocking some through. So we're doing that review at the moment.
Councillor Bevan, I know you've got a question now.
Well, I'd love to visit Larkspur Close when it's finished and have a look at one of those flats, because when I remember going in them, you had to have the lights on all day long, and that was in the summer. So I'd be really impressed and pleased to have a look. I'm really supportive of a lot of these ideas in here. I think they're really good to get in the more mix, getting more activities, more movement. I think it's all really excellent. So I wish you well. I just hope that you can get the scheme managers who've got the personality and the charisma to do all that type of stuff. You get what I mean? Because I think that's crucial, because in a lot of these schemes, the residents are not keen to come down for coffee. They won't come down to fish and chips and all this. And I just think that's a really important aspect. And the last point is, when I was the Cabinet member, we did a survey of all the schemes, and I think it was about 6 that were recognised as not appropriate for supported housing. Larkspur Close was one. Prothero House was another one, which we changed. So you've got 4 left. I don't know whether you need to spend another lot of money. Campbell Court was one of them that wasn't suitable. So whether you need spend some more money to do it again, I'm not really sure.
I think we do, is the short answer. Since those 6 properties, actually, I think there's some more now which, given the length of time and things that have changed, have also kind of been identified as perhaps not being the most suitable places. Examples being schemes with more than 2 floors that don't have a lift and things like that, because actually, as people are changing, that dynamic changes. So when I did the review, we commissioned Ridge to come and do a sort of building appraisal, which broadly identified the same buildings as had been identified previously, but also looked at some others. So thinking about, actually, do we do something like we did with Prothero House, but somewhere else? And if we do, where's the best place to do it? And sort of what will we gain from doing that? What would the older people who live there or who might live there in the future gain? So I think we will sort of continue on that kind of path of, especially when thinking about the extra care demand, what do we need and where do we need it to be and what are the best places for that? And Larkspur Close, you should go and visit. It's quite different. It is quite different.
I'll come back to you on that, Councillor Bevan. I'll give you the date, completion date.
It's on page 26. It's one of your recommendations. It's quite interesting because it says here to note the housing strategy commitment to build new specialist housing should be rigorously explored for all new proposed development work in the borough. So how is it working with all the planning applications? Are we seeing any coming through? And if not, why not? And when will we be seeing them? Since this seems to be a sensible recommendation, if we did that, we might be able then to have some positive moving about of people, as it were. And then you could decide what to do with the other sites. And can I say, Prothero House was vacant. A lesson to learn. It was vacant. I live around the corner from Prothero House. It was vacant for over a year. It cost more to have the security than to demolish. It cost a fortune in security when it was empty. And then there's, you know, squatters came, there's a whole song and dance about that. But the management of closing it to doing it took so long, it cost the council a fortune in security.
Thank you. There were a lot of lessons have been learned from the development of Prothero House and Lorenco House. So in many ways for me that makes my life quite a lot easier because I've definitely understood how not to do that and how to do that, and some of the things we did well and some of the things not so well. In terms of what was the point that you made before? Oh yes, about planning. So at the moment, no is the short answer. However, we are looking at sort of how we will build in supported housing into the sort of wood green redevelopment plans, regeneration plans. I think my view on that is it's sort of more likely to happen in larger developments because how much it costs for the sizes of supported housing normally means that you need to be building quite a larger number of units. Exactly. But
well, I mean, obviously there's nothing against having supported housing in developments. I mean, to some degree, we're dictated to by what the market comes forward with, but I'm definitely, you know, happy to have a conversation about how we might be able to promote that more. But we'd need to talk about the kind of locations and how that would actually work. We've obviously got a lot of opportunities to do that.
Okay, thank you. So that moves us on to our next item, which is temporary accommodation joint venture. So I presume, Alan, you will be updating us on this. Should we get that? So we added this. If you explain why we added this
Indeed,
to the
yes.
agenda.
The Chair asked us to come and do a short presentation on the new housing company's proposal because it was slated to go to Cabinet in March originally, and there was a publication of a expression of interest for a joint venture in January, which of course expressed some excitement.
Broke into rashes.
A number of people did. So it seemed a very good idea to come here and be able to talk through what the proposal is and talk to that Cabinet paper. That Cabinet paper is not, as you know, it didn't go in March in the end. It's now slated to go to the first available cabinets after the elections, which gives us which means I don't have a cabinet report to talk to, unfortunately, but it means it gives us a much better chance to explore the issues and talk them through before we get to any kind of decision-making process. And so we will be taking it in March. Has found it? And it was discussed briefly previously also, if you'd see the minutes from the meeting on the 7th of November, because a key part of what we're doing here is primarily around trying to reduce temporary accommodation use and needs in the borough, and there was a report scrutiny panel in November about the temporary accommodation reduction plan. And I'll start singing in a minute to vamp for time, do it in the style of interpretive dance, but I think we're here.
So I was just going to say, Noah, I know you were particularly interested in this item, and that's why you're here. You can actually come and sit at the table if you want. You have to sit in the corner.
Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you. What I'll try and do in a fairly short presentation is just set out why we're trying to do this, what the key challenge we're trying to address is. And then the second thing is the key, what my former boss always used to call the exam question. What is the exact thing we're trying to solve with this proposal and why we're going, it explains why we're going down this particular route. Then I'll talk around the solutions we have, which is 2 vehicles actually, or 2 companies, or 2 things, bodies, whatever we want to use, phrase you want to use, a community benefit society and a purchase and repair vehicle. I'll explain both of those. And then what we hope to be the outcomes at the end of actually delivering those. The challenge really is very simple. It's the fact that we just have an unsustainably large amount of people in temporary accommodation in the borough, unsustainable in many ways. It says just around 3,000. It's actually dipped just under 3,000, we're pleased to say, in the last month or two. That's the first time it's been under 3,000 in about 3 or 4 years. That's a small cheer for going in the right direction. But it is an unsustainably large number and the 3rd largest number in the country for any local authority. So it's costing the local authority enormous money. But there are 3 key costs really. One is just the quality of those homes. Those are not the kind of quality of homes that we would want to put those people into whom we have a housing duty. Some of it is fine, but some of it is really poor quality housing. Secondly, a lot of the management is in the private rented sector, quite poor quality landlords who bought up lots of former right to buys and they're letting them back to us at eye-watering amounts of money and actually providing very poor service. Some of it's very good management, but not all of it. Too much of it is very poor quality management. And thirdly, the price, both to those individuals that are in it, they're paying a lot more for their rent if they're paying some or all of their rents themselves, and it's costing the council millions of pounds a year. £7.1 million is the core temporary accommodation budget in the general fund. The council can't afford to keep paying that money year on year because that's money that should be going for other services. So in terms of the social impacts of this and in terms of the financial impacts on individuals and the council, there's a problem we really have to solve. But the challenge of solving is not always as easy as one might hope. The key question really is that simple one there. How do we utilise our right to buy receipts? Historically, we've given far too many of them back. We're not going to give any more back again. How do we then create a vehicle that produces homes that are viable rents and we're not completely restricted in the level of rents we can charge, so we can maximise rents within the housing benefit envelope? And how do we avoid creating something that builds homes then gets lost to the right to buy? So how do you create something that delivers those 3? And it means it's quite difficult to set up a simple do-it-yourself or set up a company. For example, the right to buy receipts themselves couldn't be used if we set up a wholly owned company. We couldn't give Chris and Homes of Haringey the right to buy receipts to spend. The government doesn't allow us to. God knows why the government doesn't allow us to, but that's their rules. They won't let us do it. If we used it directly ourselves as a council, spent those right to buy receipts, then we'd have to charge the social rents. We couldn't charge any rents higher than that, which would make temporary accommodation more viable. Clearly, if the government was going to give us more funding for it, we could charge lower rents. We'd like to charge us better, but we can't charge any rents but social rents if we did it ourselves. But we don't want to be giving these right to buy receipts just to a housing association or to anybody else. And if we have these rents really restricted, we couldn't repay the loans we'd need to acquire these properties. And if we used it directly ourselves as the council, then the various options might end up with us having to give people the right to buy. We're already seeing right to buy applications on the new build council homes we've done over the last few months. Immediately people move in, they put in the right to buy request. So we want to avoid that as well. We want to avoid losing the stock. And how we got to the options we came up with, we did an options appraisal. We brought in somebody who's done the options appraisals for Greenwich, for Tower Hamlets and for Lewisham to look at the options we could use. We went to legal advice from the people that actually set up companies in or advised the set up of companies in other local authorities. And we did financial modelling with a financial modeller to make sure I was stacked up financially using an external financial modeller who similarly had done this for other authorities. So we lent on other people. We're not the first people by any means to do these things, and the advantage that gives you is you can use other people's expertise and use their learning. And we're setting up 2 vehicles, and why are we doing 2 rather than just 1? Why are we doing the Community Benefit Society and this Purchase, Repair and Management vehicle? Why are we doing 2? They both do the same core things. They both deliver homes, and it's primarily for temporary accommodation. These are not about building council homes. These are not about building homes to market sale. If we want to do that, we do other types of vehicles. They're not about doing estate renewal. If you want to do that, you need a different type of vehicle. These are explicitly for the purpose of acquiring properties to use for temporary accommodation to bring them numbers. And they're both aiming to do 400 units each. Key thing is neither of them have any element of a transfer of local authority assets into the vehicle. Neither of them do that, and in fact both do the opposite, and either immediately or at the end of a process they municipalise existing private sector assets and bring them into the public sector, so the council takes ownership of private sector assets through both of these vehicles. The core difference, and why we're doing the two, is the Community Benefit Society is a capital-based vehicle. We put our capital into that vehicle. We use our right to buy funding, we use our own general fund borrowing and capital, and we acquire properties. Whereas the purchase and repair vehicle is a revenue vehicle. There we don't put any capital in, but we give a revenue guarantee to these people to a certain extent. And so they're working on two very different ways of funding, but basically they're trying to achieve the same aim. To go through the Community Benefit Society, there's a short quote there which sets out how it's defined in the marvellously named Cooperative and Community Benefit Societies Act 2014. And basically this is the act that introduced a new form of society, the Community Benefit Society, the CBS, which is basically replacing what used to be the old industrial and providence societies, which most housing associations started off as being. So it's trying to say what would be a genuine co-op or genuine providential society. And the language itself, it almost seems redolent of the sort of the 60s and 70s if you talk about what its purpose, primary aim is of a community benefit society. And in the outline of the model, how it would work, with the Community Benefit Society, the council itself would purchase 400 properties. We purchase this, and we expect predominantly or nearly all of them to be within the borough itself. And we would fund that through general fund capital and through using our right to buy receipts. The council would then lease these properties to this Cooperative Benefit Society, Community Benefit Society, probably for a 10-year period. So we give them a lease. So the council always owns the properties, it leases them to the society. The Community Benefit Society then refurbishes them to a really high standard and sets the rents, which are usually about LHA levels at the maximum, hopefully lower than that. And then we get Homes for Haringey to manage the properties. So they're managed by Homes for Haringey. Now, the key thing here, the reason we can put right to buy receipts in and charge those rents is it's not a wholly owned company. The council cannot, in law, be controlling the company. It needs to be independent, have an independent board, and the minority of board members must be council nominees. But there are enormous amounts of things you can do to influence that CBS and make it do exactly what you want. We write its constitution, what it can and cannot do. We give it all the properties on the lease, and the lease have conditions attached to the lease. We give it its only finance, and we can tell it not to take finance from anybody else or lease from anybody else, only from us. And we put conditions on that financing. So it's very much influence is controlled, but we can't ever say, and I couldn't put in here in this presentation even that we control it, in case any lawyer ever saw the presentation and said that we were trying to control this company. It has to be seen to be legally independent. That way we can give it the right to buy receipts and charge viable rents. And as I say, we always own the properties. Council owns them all the way through. And that model is already up and running in Tower Hamlets, exactly the same model as we're proposing here. And we've got the same legal people advising us, the financial modellers who advise them at Tower Hamlets, and it's working quite effectively for them already. And they're using it for the same purpose we are, to acquire properties which are in the borough, usually often former right to buy properties. They're buying back in and using them for temporary accommodation. And at the end of that lease period, they expect to then use them predominantly as social rented housing. So that's the Cooperative Benefit Society. The purchase and repair and maintenance joint vehicle is slightly different. It has the same core aim to acquire about 400 properties over 2 or 3 years. These are more likely to be out of the borough, still definitely within London, still definitely within northwest London, presumably almost all in contiguous boroughs around us, but not so much in the borough. And that's because actually there are many cheaper places to buy just outside the borough than just in. And it balances up the ability of us to buy the larger family-sized homes within the borough across the two. It'll be a 50-50 joint venture in the way it works, but we don't put anything into that joint venture. All the capital for the joint venture is acquired by the other partner. Partner takes a bond out, takes borrowing out, probably about £100 million the joint venture partner borrows. What we provide is what we call a void guarantee. We guarantee to give them a tenant. So we guarantee that there will be no voids, that we will always make sure we nominate them as a tenant. They take the risk on the rent, they take the risk on damages, on repairs and everything else. We just take guarantee we will nominate someone to that property. We're allowed a certain allowance, I think it's about 2 or 3% per year, Is it that right? 2%. 2% per year of vacants, because it's bound to happen, there's bound to be some. But after that, we have to give that void guarantee. So it's a revenue guarantee. The purchase and repair agent then refurbishes the homes to high standard, the same as the CBS would. The rents again will be up to LHA levels at maximum, same as the CBS. And the registered provider will manage the homes. It could be Homes for Haringey, or it may be a registered provider. We'll need to see who we work with on this. The council will have control over which units are purchased. We will sign off every single unit to make sure we're happy they meet the homes we want. And we also sign off before they're let that we're happy with the standard of the property they're let at. So we have a guarantee over that. And ultimately, at the end of the period, and we're negotiating with various people about how long that period is, whether it's 25, 30 or 40 years, the properties will become council properties. So during the period when they're being let through the purchase and repair JV, that JV owns them. At the end of the period, they become council properties. So like the CBS, it's municipalising private properties. And where we are with the JV at the moment is we put a procurement notice out in January, and we had some very good responses. We had 3 very sort of people we would very be happy to work with. I was hoping by now, if the cabinet papers go in there, we can tell you a bit more detail about who they are and what their plans are, but it's all at this point commercially confidential, but that will clearly be in the cabinet paper who they are. And we expect to be able to say when we get to cabinet paper who we've chosen to be the partner and who the other people were and why we chose who we chose. And there's slight variations within these elements here, but the core of it, what's on the slides there, is that all of them will deliver that core. And the outcome then of these 2 different vehicles is that we will acquire about 800 properties. That can be expanded, but it's 800 at first. Ultimately, all these will be owned by the council. That means at any one point, once we've got all those properties, 3,500 Haringey residents who are currently in temporary accommodation will be in better quality and much more affordable housing. We think we'll save about £3 to £4 million per annum on our temporary accommodation costs once we've got all the properties acquired, and we will make much more efficient use of council right to buy receipts than we have done previously when we have ignominiously sent them back to the government by failing to spend them. And that is a quick whistle-top story is what we're planning for these new housing companies. As I say, the key to it is both of them are very much set up for one purpose only, acquiring stock we can use to TA, not to do some of the other things you might wish wholly owned companies to do, either building council housing, doing estate renewal or anything else.
So I've got a few questions, but I'm going to let other people start. Councillor Carter.
Say one thing before you come in. I should have introduced my colleague, Fred, who has actually done all the work on this. I'm just the show pony explaining it to you, but he's done all the heavy lifting, not me.
Thank you, Chair. I have 2 questions. The first one is, what pleases the attraction? It all sounds very interesting. What is the attraction, please, for the joint venture partner? That's the first question. And the second question is a much smaller one, referring to something you said a little earlier in your speech. You mentioned that you were getting right to buy requests on properties that were only a few months old. Could you expand on that? I don't quite follow that. I thought that tenants had to be in occupation for 2 years or 3 years or some fairly longer period. Thank you.
On the right to buy issue that came up, Councillor Carter, we had someone who moved into one of our new properties, and basically because they were a transfer, they transferred in with their rights in terms of being able to exercise the right to buy. So they have made a formal request around that. I can't tell you any more details because it's still early stages in terms of the right to buy request. But obviously, any property effectively that we develop ourselves within the HRA has the potential for someone to exercise the right to buy after 5 years of being a 5 years of being a Haringey tenant.
I'll take it in turns. The attraction of joint venture to the partners. We got 3 different consortia have contacted us, and they've got slightly different models in terms of what they get out of it. The core to it is that they will borrow, and because they've got us giving a a void guarantee behind them. They can borrow at very good levels from the banks, and it's a long-term project as well, so they get good level borrowing. Then they make their money by doing three things. One, when they will have a consortium of people with them that will do the acquisitions, so they get the estate agent fees in effect for acquiring the properties. They will do the bringing them back into a decent standard, so they get the maintenance contract they would have for that. So you get the companies involved with this are the ones that do major repairs and maintenance contracts for local authorities, and they will have a maintenance contract on an ongoing basis as well for the whole period we have it, to make sure the properties are maintained to that standard. So they will get those kind of things, and two of them at least have got a housing association already in the consortium that's actually part of that consortium that will do the management and therefore will take a management fee. So even though we save an awful lot of money, there is enough within those for them to actually turn a profit over that period. So there is an attraction to them. And we were actually a little surprised just the strength of the bids we got. That it's really clearly quite an attractive option for these organisations to do. Anything you want to add, Fred, on that?
No, I think Alan sets it out quite well. I think there's considerable refurbishment fees, say, for £15,000 over 400 or even 800 units if you tended to two things together. And obviously there's housing management fees, and also as well there's perhaps a little margin on the money's been involved as well, because we effectively make the money cheaper for them. But as Alan says, we've had three very strong bids.
Sorry, so I kind of know the answer to it, but I know it will be the question that other people will have in their minds. So obviously these management fees, these repairs, that we would be paying for that, wouldn't we? I presume.
Yeah, that would all come out of the rent.
So that's so obviously we will be investing money in it, which is fine. You know, nothing comes for free. But we can borrow cheaply as well. So there could be arguments where people say, well, why don't we borrow the money to do this? I mean, obviously, I know it's a lot of money, but because I know when we had the discussion, you explained some of that to me. If you could maybe go into that a little bit more.
Yep, exactly. That's a very good question to ask, and the answer is we are doing that. That's what the CBS model would do. So if we're going to borrow and invest and buy ourselves, we'd do that through the CBS model. That's where we'd put our capital assets into there. This other one enables us to acquire stock without any borrowing of ourselves or any capital of ourselves.
Councillor Brabazon and then Councillor Tucker.
So going to the PR&M model, it's like, I'm trying to think of a parallel. It's like where you have a leasing scheme and you get the equipment at the end of it, really. So it's like it's like an HP. That's what I thought. So like the school will do that with IT equipment. So do they make their money? They're going to borrow the capital bond at a low interest rate. They then purchase the properties, and then they make the money on the revenue streams of the rents and the maintenance and the refurbs. Is that right?
Yeah, most of the people that approach us have had a consortium of people that will do all the various bits in it. So somebody has to buy the property, then you pay someone for doing all the work of conveyancing, soliciting, etc. That somebody has to then bring the property up to a decent standard, so you pay a company to do all that work. Somebody then has to manage the properties, so you pay a company to do that. Someone does ongoing repairs, you pay a company to do that. Somebody actually do the repairs then in the handover, you do that as well. And between tenancies, you'll do another refurbishment. So each of those have a cost, which in our own stock, Homes for Haringey do all of that piece of work, for example, and there's a cost to each part of that, and there's enough in those costs for them to make it profitable to them to pay off the interest on that loan.
If people are buying the properties, I suppose my question would be, where's the catch? That would be my real question. Where's the catch? And is it too good to be true, like the other scheme that we're not talking about tonight? So that was my first question. The second question is really about where you would be purchasing properties were this to happen, because you're saying this would be outside of the borough, because Haringey has been selling its own street properties for years, which personally I always thought was daft, but that's what the council was doing. And so now, we're having divested ourselves of our street properties, or we seem to have, we're now looking for street properties somewhere else. So I'd just like to know where, is it in the specification where you would be looking, how far away out of the borough the families would then have to relocate, responsibility for, like in social care terms, who's responsible, say it's a child protection issue, things like that. I mean, there's quite a lot of sort of and am I asking sensible questions? I don't know, Alan. Yeah.
My presumption is that because this is for people in temporary accommodation, that is there a significant number of our people in temporary accommodation that we've placed outside the borough anyway, for example?
There probably will be significant numbers brought to Enfield simply because it's cheap compared to Haringey. The key is that we'd like to buy as many as possible in the borough. But there's two reasons why we don't really. One is that we want to buy all these quickly. The sooner we buy these, the sooner we start saving very significant sums from our temporary accommodation budgets. And if we suddenly bought 800 properties in Haringey, we'd be creating a false floor on the market. It would just be too big. So we need to think about that's one issue. Particularly at the moment, the market is quite shaky. And actually, this is probably the best possible time to be going in and buying properties over the next few years. Secondly, what we're really keen on is the stock we buy through the CBS, which will be directly going into Homes for Haringey, being much more 2-3 bedroom homes, etc. That will be perfect for turning straight into council stock when we stop using it as TA and actually meet the needs for families within the borough. It's more likely the stuff outside the borough will be smaller 1 and 2 beds instead, rather than the larger family homes, and that enables us to buy a lot more homes a lot cheaper. The more we require but it's worth saying that each individual purchase will sign off, and the Cabinet itself, post-May, can make a decision as it goes along. Does it want to shift that balance of where those homes are, where they won't? At the moment, we're telling all the people who are bidding it's going to have to be in London, in North West London, preferably in contiguous boroughs to here. So nowhere south of the river, nowhere over in Ealing, or nowhere outside London at all. We're telling them very clearly so. But it can be we can frame this further from the Cabinet as we go forward, exactly where you want them to be, and flex over time.
So, but I suppose, are other boroughs doing this? Because obviously you're talking about doing lots of, purchasing lots of property in other boroughs, probably in somewhere like Enfield by the sounds of it. What do Enfield think about us kind of stretching out into their, planting our flags on their territory?
Well,
municipalising Enfield to an extent.
And the interesting thing is the municipalisation, the advantage, when you have ones out the borough, we look at the end of that leasing period with them. We might decide to sell them and use that revenue then to municipalise stuff within our own borough. So we'll be able to decide what to do with the capital at the end. And the one borough that's gone a long way down this particular joint venture route is Bromley, and they're actually planning, when they get to the end, not to acquire the stock, but to sell the stock, put it all into their pension fund. So actually there's different horses for courses of what you can do with the capital. And certainly our finance director was quite keen on that idea for ourselves to sort of shore up our pension fund going forward. So you can do various things. The other thing I'll say about how Enfield feel about it, Enfield, like a number of other boroughs, are actually doing a very similar model to us, very similar to this, but acquiring outside London altogether. So are Barnet. They've done a deal, in fact, with one of the people we're talking to. They've done a deal with them just to acquire a lot of private sector funding in a very similar model, but it's all going to be acquired outside London. So actually, the more they acquire outside London, the better, because we can acquire in their borough, while they're going somewhere else. But Fred, do you want to come in?
I was just going to add, it will be very difficult for us to go out and buy, say, 800 properties. That we did both of these things in Haringey and the neighbouring boroughs. So what we're hoping for is actually, and it's starting to happen slightly, is that developers are starting to come to us and say, do you want to buy our block of flats, which we're completing in 6 months' time? And the other thing we're hoping for is that the legislation, particularly the tax legislation, is changing a lot around for buy-to-let landlords. And they may not be hoping this, but we're hoping they get into financial trouble in the next couple of years, and then we will buy them up as part of this programme. So that's how we're aiming to do it. We do think we're in quite a good spot in terms of buying it. In terms of what Alan said, I think the reason why we keep using the words predominant is that we want to be very careful not to say we'll buy 500 units in Haringey, because as Alan said, we're pushing up the price. And these people we're hoping who go under in the next couple of years will maybe wait until we arrive to bail them out.
I just want to talk about that right to buy you mentioned. My understanding was a new property would be extremely expensive because of the debt against it for a new right to buy application. And then another point is, have we not missed a trick there? Because should we not have filled those new properties that we built with people on the waiting list rather than transfer people in who had a right to buy already waiting there, with perhaps a special lettings policy so that we at least delayed that for 5 years, in which case the law might have changed by then?
On the lettings thing, I can exactly see your point on that, and it does stick in the craw that we should build a brand new home, finally get around to building some new homes in Haringey and see them potentially lost on the right to buy. I have a feeling these probably won't be able to get the right to buy because there's also a floor price in right to buy, which is defined by the amount of money you have spent on that property over recent years, and we spent the entire construction cost over recent years. So I think that will pretty much rule out the right to buy for that individual, but we can keep you informed on this, what happens. It would be quite difficult to have a policy, though, that we don't move people between properties because they got the right to buy, because clearly the families moved into it's quite a large family property.
Yeah.
Would have been very overcrowded where they
People
were.
are waiting for a long time for transfers.
Yeah, and they may well put a right to buy if we moved to another home anyway. So they were a very high priority to move, obviously, in what was a very nice home. But it reinforces one of those key things, going back to that exam question, that we want to make sure what we set up does not have the right to buy on it. Until the government changes right to buy policy, we can't afford to be losing the stuff we're acquiring through these properties. And neither of these two mechanisms would create anything that has the right to buy attached to them, because they're in because they're in separate companies.
But also, let's not forget that somebody who's been transferred into a property has voided another one. So it's not. Councillor Tucker.
Hi, thank you. If you could bear with me, I've got a series of very, very short questions. So firstly, the issue of not being able to put your right to buy receipts into a body which you own and control yourself, is the issue the ownership or the control or both?
You can do if you own any company that's wholly owned by the local authority. You cannot put your right to buy receipts in. So it's about the ownership.
So it's about the ownership. So of these two vehicles which are going to be set up, which of them is going to get the right to buy receipts, or is it both?
The right to buy receipts will go into the CBS, because that's the capital vehicle. The joint venture is entirely a revenue-backed vehicle.
So in fact, there's no reason why the second vehicle shouldn't be wholly owned?
If it's wholly owned, then the right to buy would apply to it.
I'm talking about the right to buy receipts going into one of the vehicles.
If it's wholly owned, the right to buy receipts can't go into the vehicle. So you're right, we could wholly own joint venture, but then we wouldn't get the external borrowing.
Well, we don't need the external borrowing because we can borrow the money ourselves, as Enfield are doing with their project. Sorry,
Councillor Tucker, are you asking whether we can borrow the money ourselves, or are you saying we can? Is it a question?
If I'm wrong, please point it out to me and how and why.
Because I thought I'd asked that question earlier, but if you could go into it again, that would be fine.
Okay, hopefully I can clarify on this. In terms of the CBS is going to take approximately £100 million. The PRN itself, we're not sure about whether we can put right to buy receipts into that, because it needs clarification legally on that. So,
Let me ask the question again that I asked earlier, Noah, and then you can tell me if I'm grossly wrong. Let's simplify it. Why can't we borrow the money ourselves to buy the properties and just do it ourselves and not go to a consortium or a company outside? That's your question, isn't it? Yes, the second vehicle. Why can't we Yeah, so you're asking this, forget the first one, let's park that. The second vehicle, why can't we borrow the money ourselves? I don't think you said we can't. I think you said that it would just mean we would have to borrow a lot of money, but if you could repeat that, that would be fine.
Clearly, there's a limit in the end to how much money capital we can put in, how much borrowing we put in, and we'd want to put all our capital and borrowing that we can put in into the CBS. It would make more sense to put it there than put it into the other vehicle. The other vehicle is acquiring properties without us putting the capital into it. The whole purpose of it is us not to put capital in, but to use it for revenue guarantee. So it doubles our ability to acquire stock without requiring any additional borrowing or capital. So yes, we absolutely could do what you suggest, put capital and borrowing into the joint venture, but it would be much better for us to put it into the CBS and get our returns there. What we may choose to do, and this will be for a future cabinet to look at further down the line, is decide to put in some additional capital into the joint venture, exactly as you suggest, not to replicate them having to do the borrowing, but may want to use that to help bring down the rents perhaps, or to acquire more properties in the borough or something like that. But the key principle is one's a capital vehicle, one's a revenue vehicle, and that way you double your delivery.
But I think I know what you're asking now. I think you don't want. You're asking why it should be a joint venture, why it can't just be.
The second vehicle, the PRM, I still haven't heard a reason why we can't totally own it, totally control it.
Right. So I think what you're asking.
And borrow the money.
Okay.
Can I
but I don't think you're asking the questions clearly. So,
okay. Let me take up one issue that's been raised. So. The assumption appears to be that there's a limit on the amount of money that we can borrow to do this project. I'm not aware that there is such a limit, and if there is, I'd be interested in what it is. If there is no limit, as I suspect, sorry? But our ability to repay it depends on the income that we get, and that income would be identical whether this was a jointly owned vehicle or a single owned vehicle. The income stream would be exactly the same, and the expenditure would actually be more if it was jointly owned, because we have to cover their costs and their profits.
Councillor Tucker, so your question is why we can't just not do it as a joint venture, okay? Just borrow the money ourselves and basically do it as a wholly owned vehicle. I hate the word vehicle now. As a wholly owned company whereby we buy the properties, we repair them, we rent them out as temporary accommodation. I think that's your question. Okay, and that's a shorter way of asking it. But can you answer that question before you move on to the next one, if that's all right?
Yeah. We can do this. As I say, if we have capital, it would be better to put it in the CBS where we'd achieve all the things you want to achieve. Already in the CBS, we just put more capital into that rather than the other one. The advantage of this model is it gets somebody else to borrow, and we just have a revenue commitment in the long term. We could wholly own it. Then if you wholly own it, we wouldn't be able to put right to borrow receipts, as we said, so it would have to be our borrowing. We couldn't use right to borrow receipts to make it very difficult. If we wholly own it, then we would get into questions also about what level of rents we could charge, as we found before. So we don't want to wholly own the company, which is why the CBS is a model that's not wholly owned. If you wholly own it, then our legal advice from our own lawyers and our QC is that we have to charge social rent levels, which would not allow us to do the borrowing we would require to actually make this viable to achieve the problems for temporary accommodation. What you'll almost be looking at is the model that would enable you to build social rented housing, which is not what these two models are set up to do. These models are about acquiring homes for temporary accommodation. But as the key thing is keeping in mind there's two separate, one's a capital model, one's a revenue model, and that's the difference.
So what I would ask is how come I don't want to be disrespectful in any way, but Enfield have a model in which they have a wholly owned development vehicle that does quite a lot of what the Part 2 vehicle, the PRM, is doing, and they're doing it wholly owned, and they are not just charging social rents, they're getting the full amount of housing benefit that's available to people. So I'm wondering about that, and I want to come to... Yes, and it is indeed, absolutely sure. And I spoke to Ahmet only last Sunday about this particular model. He's the cabinet member for for housing and regen in Enfield, and that's the model that they use. I'm not sure I'm going to get an answer on that one, but I'd welcome one. But otherwise, I'd be happy to move on to the issue of the CBS section.
Yeah, we are aware of the Enfield model. In fact, myself and Fred went up to meet Enfield to talk through their model and talk through the possibilities of working together. Enfield, I have to say, and it grates me rather, did have rather different legal advice from us. Our legal advice and our QC gave us somewhat different advice to Enfield about what we could and couldn't do. The Enfield model itself, though, is quite a small-scale model by comparison, and it's actually buying a lot of much smaller units than we'd want to buy as well. So we could pursue that model. We need to get different legal advice than we currently have. But the core thing for us, as I keep saying in this thing, is that if we wanted to have a wholly owned model, we wouldn't do it through the whole JV thing. The whole JV thing is about getting somebody else to take that capital risk and bring in other resources that we wouldn't otherwise get access to. If we wanted to just do it for a capital model, we put more capital into the CBS, because that would be the simplest way of doing it, rather than actually trying to create the JV model by entirely using our own capital.
To ask a question. So I suppose my worry is that Bromley are doing this. Are they the only borough doing it at the moment? Because they're not really our colour, are they? Let's be frank.
Bromley are the only borough that have completed on this. The bidders we were talking to are in discussion with several other boroughs, and we're fairly sure that some of them will come to fruition soon, and some of them will be of a different political colour to Bromley, I believe. Yeah.
Initially, there was a company that was mentioned that was going to be the partner around this, and so obviously it then went out to procurement. Has that company bid as well? I know obviously we've got to be careful around commercial confidentiality, etc., but could you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there was one company. Bromley, when they set this up, didn't do a procurement exercise. They just were approached by a company with the deal, thought this looks like a good deal, and did the deal. We didn't like that approach. We thought we should actually do a proper procurement, and we're glad we did, because we had very competitive procurement from very serious players, not just the one organisation that did the deal with Bromley. Yes, the foreign engine company have got thrown their hat in the ring, yes. Yeah.
Because, anyway, I won't raise it now. So, Councillor Brabazon and then Councillor Carter, and then I'll go back to you, Noah.
Now, were these to go ahead, who would people have their tenancies with in both of the capital mod, the Community Benefit Society, and with the repair and maintenance? Who would actually be their landlord? And would these be permanent homes? I mean, there's quite a lot of questions about the actual... sorry? It would still be TA. So they would then be moved on. So there would still be people in TA, but it would be Haringey TA, as it were. Can you just... maybe I've just lost the plot there. Can you just clarify? Thank you.
Yeah, it will be either temporary accommodation or PRS for discharge. It won't be social housing, it won't be council housing. The landlord will be, in the joint venture model, would be the registered partner, a housing association that's in the consortium with the other bidders. So it has to be a registered partner, a registered housing association. For the CBS, I'm not sure, the legal landlord might well be the CBS rather than Homes for Haringey, but Homes for Haringey would be the managing agent, and they would have in effect an AST, but with security and for 3 or 5 year AST with a fixed sub-market rent.
We know that some people live in temporary accommodation for years and years. It becomes, more or less like their home. So I realise you're working this all up and so on. So was would the plan be to move people on back into council housing, and if it's not in the borough, I'm really can't see where would they be resident in the other borough. Yes, all the rules about if you're that long, you become the other borough's responsibility for social services and all of that stuff, even though they've been placed by Haringey. I mean, I think those sorts of issues might need some sorting out, or is it all crystal clear?
Oh, things are rarely crystal clear in life. The government is actually changing the rules in terms of that. There used to be 3 years and you could discharge duty elsewhere. Now they call it 5 years in the Homeless Reduction Act. So that's... sorry, not in the Homeless Reduction, in the new homelessness guidance that's produced, code of guidance that's out for draft. It's now a 5-year window, not 3 years. These people would still retain, would still be their landlord, would still be the borough they would come back to. The reason we want to buy predominantly the homes and the CBS in the borough is to make sure anybody with those social need housing problems we will keep in the borough, we provide services to. We don't want to be moving those people out of the borough, so these would be more robust families that would move out. And yes, they would still be in forms of temporary accommodation, but it would be much better quality temporary accommodation. It would be cheaper for them, cheaper for the council, and they have a decent, proper landlord in the home. So in every way, it's better for them than what they currently have. We're not moving people from social housing into TA. We're moving people from really poor quality TA into better quality TA. So it's an improvement for them. What we'd like to do is move them into social rented housing, but we don't have the capacity. Absolutely.
Councillor, one of the things we're looking at with our colleagues from Homes for Haringey is tenancy sustainability. So we're looking at strategies when if people moved outside the borough that we can support them either directly or indirectly and sort of attempt to get them into work. Because for both them and us, it makes sense if they stay in that place and they basically make a success of wherever they go to. But in terms of, say, the allocations, obviously, like most things, it's, you know, if someone wanted a property in Haringey rather than a property outside Haringey, they'd have to probably wait longer. So therefore, people will sort of self-decide whether in borough or out of borough.
Councillor Carter.
Thank you, Chair. I said earlier that I thought this was an interesting proposal, and I think that I suspect the motivation for it is, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of this, is to save really quite significant amounts of money. And I have to say I'd much rather see savings made in this area than some of the other areas this council has found it necessary to make savings in. I think you partly answered one of my questions, which was, I think you said the properties needed to be acquired quickly. Could you say a wee bit more, please, about how quickly the savings may be affected? And these are, I mean, potentially these are very significant savings that I think we really badly need to make. So how quick could the savings be effected? And I think you said that the properties acquired would eventually revert to our ownership. Over what period, please? Thank you.
I'll start at the end in terms of the ownership issues. In terms of the JV, our sort of bottom line on that is a period of 40 years. The properties would revert to us. Obviously, as part of the bidding process, if someone bids and says we will return them to you in 30 years, then that's obviously a plus, because the sooner we actually have the ownership of them, the better. In terms of the savings, the average savings we work at, if we have a unit under our control for a year, it'll be about £4,000 per property for a 2-bed and £5,000 for a 3-bed. So we are envisaging, if once the programme would be in place, and hopefully that will be 2.5 years' time, that the savings would be something in the region of £3 to £4 million.
Let me just clarify something. So 30 or 40 years. So they buy the properties, we fix them all up. We pay for them to fix it all up. No, they fix it. That's at their cost. Yeah, no. Feel free to jump in.
In the JV option, the bond covers every single aspect of the cost. We never, I wouldn't say a penny, but very few pennies of ours.
So we won't be paying for the repair.
No, that would come out of the bond ones.
Okay. So if it was over 30, 40 years, so all we would be paying, or we would be covering, we would be providing them with tenants, and obviously we should make the assumption, but the rents will cover their borrowing, and in some cases we would be paying that through housing benefit, etc. We can't say that that will be in all cases. So it feels like some kind of 30, 40 year kind of mortgage, but not really, because technically we're not paying for it. It's just all we're doing is saying to them, we're going to guarantee you people who are going to be paying the rent on that property. Yeah, it's like a guaranteed income stream, in a sense, for them.
The key thing for us is that one of the people who we bid to would like us to give them an income guarantee or a rent guarantee. We're not doing that. What we're doing is giving them a void guarantee. We will guarantee them the tenant. It's their job to collect the rent, and it's their job to take any risk of any loss of rent because someone doesn't pay, not ours. So it's not an income guarantee, it's a void guarantee, which is quite a difference for us risk-wise. It's not simple. I mean, if it's too good to be true, then it's probably not true, as we all know. So we have to look at gift offer now very, very closely. And the advantage is, as I said, we're not the first people to be doing this, and we're not the only people going down this route at the moment. And although we may all have our own views about Bromley and Bromley's way of working, etc., at least we can see very clearly how it's working there for them. So we can actually...
Bromley, I think, have been purchasing properties now for about 18 months, and on a commercial and a housing management basis, it's been quite successful. But I do think it sort of bodes well, the fact that we've got 3 strong bidders for this, so therefore...
Have they seen the savings initially? Have they seen the savings in temporary accommodation?
Yes, they have been making savings, yeah.
There you go.
So back to the CBS.
And can you ask questions, please?
Okay. I'll start asking questions. So back to the CBS. So it's clear that it can't be fully under council control. So is it so clear that it can't be fully council owned? And if so, who would we share ownership with?
I'm not clear. I don't know what you asked there, Noah.
Sorry. It's
just don't ask the same question, but in
under the 2014 Act, it has to be an independent body. We can have influence over it, but we can only have a minority influence in terms of the board. So.
So it would be a sovereign entity, but we would be putting all the money into it. And that would be a combination of right-to-buy receipts and money that we'd borrowed and were investing into it. And we could appoint up to 50% of the board. What proportion of the board could we appoint?
In the model we've been using, say it's 5 people on the board, 2 out of the 5, so less than 50%.
I'll say one thing. It's best to think what this is really. It's a shell. This isn't really a company that's going to have existence. It's not like Homes for Haringey.
Alan, can I remind you are on being filmed.
We're not saying anything that's not fairly apparent. It's not like Homes for Haringey. We won't have a manager, director, a whole bunch of staff and offices and do anything really useful. This will be a vehicle that exists in law.
It's a loophole,
it exists in law for us to, as many local authorities, every local authority in London is finding ways of setting up companies, wholly owned, partially owned, non-owned, arm's length, etc., to try and get around government restrictions on what you can do a right to buy, what rents you can charge, to try and solve that exam question that I set out. So this is a shell that we can't control, but it's a sovereign body as a shell. So there'll be 5 people on the board which will essentially make decisions. But everything else will be defined by the council.
Where would the other, so say you've got a board of 5 people and 2 of them are yours, where would the other 3 people materialise from? Who are they?
Not in a totally dissimilar way to Homes for Harringay, you'd pick 3 community members that you trust and have confidence in. For example, you could choose to have the board being, the Director of Housing, the Director of Regeneration, and the financial, legal and technical advisors advise us on this, and that would be your board, and they would make the formal decisions. But the key point is, what the organisation can do is defined by its constitution, and we would write the constitution. How it uses assets is defined by what we say when we give it the... We have the properties on a lease with a covenant on the lease what they can use the properties for, and we give them money, and we tell them what they can use that money for, and we say you can't take any other money from anybody else, you can't borrow from anybody else or take any assets from anybody else unless we agree. So we set the constitution really, really restrictively, but we don't control legally, in legal terms, that body. That's kind of how it works.
Well, wow.
One last question. Again on the CBS. So even though the other company is called, about repairs, etc., the CBS would need its houses modified, refurbished, maintained, etc. And so who would be doing that work? And could the council do it by contracting with the CBS?
Yes, we can tell the CBS who can do that work, so we can define who it is. And our intention would be, at the moment, to say that should be Homes for Harringay, should do all that work, and manage, they should do all the refurbishment, bring the stock up to the standard, manage it and do the repairs contracts. That's the simplest way and the most effective way we think of running it.
To be clear now where you're going with this, I mean, Homes for Harringay subcontracts their repairs. I mean, we don't have a DLO.
They do now.
Just for clarity, we have a 130-strong DLO. We have a 130-strong DLO that works within Homes for Harringay right across the full range of trades. So the work that we subcontract is our major refurbishment works, and we subcontract about 10% of the work that comes through the repair service.
Is there any potential, just as an aside, to expand that DLO?
I think there is. I think anyone who's a user of the repair service at the moment, customer of the repair service, their tenants and leaseholders, would tell you that we've got some work to do within that repair service to get it where it needs to be. But I think, I think over the next 6 months to a year, we'll achieve that, and then there's certainly an option to expand.
To go on this model, the CBS and it was all subcontract Homes for Harringay, could you then set up your own in-house apprenticeship programme, for example, through the apprenticeship levy and things like that?
Yeah, we've currently got 6 apprentices within the repair service. Certainly, if we expand, there's no reason why we can't expand the number of apprentices we've got. We're actually looking over the next couple of years to bring in more apprentices across the trades to ensure that we've got quite a high-aged workforce, and we want to make sure that we're prepared for some of the operatives that may retire over the next few years.
Is there any capacity in the long term to develop or expand a DLO to take in major works?
I think certainly there's aspects of major works that the DLO could do. There's certain specialist works that we will always need to subcontract without a significant capital upfront cost. So scaffolding, specialist roofing layers, asbestos are certainly all areas that we'd still need to subcontract. The kitchens and bathrooms are standard type of work. There's no reason why the DLO couldn't look to do that in the future. I would want to stabilise the current service and make sure that we're delivering a high level of services to tenants and leaseholders before we did that.
This is just, obviously, I'm sounding things out here, because I'm quite interested in DLOs, as I know Councillor Tucker is as well. So in terms of, see, much as people will be surprised, I'm not against councils being entrepreneurial, okay? So, and generally local authorities do, in some cases, tend to be like trusted local providers. What about looking at selling those, if you could expand selling those types of services, because people, you know, obviously are, you know, interested in when they need repairs done to their private properties, or maybe they're responsible for that repair themselves, to pay somebody, perhaps a council, to come and do it. Isn't that something that could be explored?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things. It's one of the things that's on. We've got a repairs, what we call a repairs service improvement plan, and it's one thing that's on the forward plan for the repairs service once we reach a certain level of performance, and that's to be able to sell services to our own leaseholders and then branch out into the wider community. But we say until we reach the performance level that we've set for the repair service, we're not going to branch out into other things.
Councillor Carter.
Thank you, Chair. I think whatever reservations there may be about this, I think we need to recognise that this would be a preferable situation to the one we have at the moment, with so much money being paid out in rent to private landlords in poor conditions, and it's even preferable, dare I say it, to the other joint venture, and we've had discussion about the HDV. Now, what my question is, and I'm sure you thought about this, what do you see as the main risks of this, please? Thank you.
The CBS or the joint venture or both? He said playing for time, both. Okay. The CBS, like any kind of arm's length body, the risk is always that it goes native and you lose control. That's the biggest risk of any of those things. And Fred can give you his experience in Newham with a similar sort of organisation that did. And the key to managing that risk is absolutely how you control it at the beginning, how you write its constitution, and how you set out in the covenants on its leases and on the financing arrangements, how it limits what it can do. So it can't suddenly do what some of these ventures have done and go off and do other things. So you very much limit its article of association, what it can do. And so that's the key risk, and that's the key thing to do there. The key risk on the joint venture is possibly, the one that gets thrown at me, is if it's based upon long-term income stream coming from tenants claiming local housing allowance, and that's what makes it work for the joint venture. If the government changes the rules around local housing allowance, etc., then that could be very potentially damaging for the joint venture. But on the other hand, if we stay where we currently are, with all our tenants currently in the type of temporary accommodation they are, based upon LHA, it's an even bigger risk. So the risk of actually doing it is less than the risk of not doing it for the biggest risk that faces those. For both of them, there's also the risk that actually they're premised on the sort of the housing market itself. The housing market could take quite a significant dip, but that actually has all sorts of other costs and benefits that far outweigh the risk of this particular models for the authority as a whole. So if the economy goes off the edge of a cliff, then yes, this would suffer, but so would so many other things suffer more. Have I missed any key risk, Fred?
So when you're talking about Newham, I suppose if you look at the history of Poplar Harker as well, didn't they go a bit...
I'll I'll not try not to dwell too much on my past history, and I can take that offline and explain it to people. But in terms of the risk, I think the big risk is property prices. We're going out to buy 800 units, and if we bought them at the top of the market and house prices crashed, then our model doesn't work. But the good thing about what we're doing is we're doing everything sequentially. You know, we buy a couple of units, we press the button, does the viability still work? We keep doing that. And from where we're sitting at the minute, right, we seem to be in a good place, because what the market, people like Savills, who are probably the best guessers in this area, they seem to be saying the prices will go down for the next couple of years while we're buying, and then they will increase after that. So we do seem to be in quite a good place about managing our risk, which is buying at the top of the market and then having to sell when prices are much lower.
Questions? Are you done? Are you? Yep. You sure? I'm looking at Councillor Tucker. Okay.
So I suppose it's your choice, really. This is quite a long presentation that covers all issues. Obviously, you've been circulated with the response that we've already submitted. So I don't know whether you want me to give this presentation or whether you just want to ask questions. Totally up to you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on this response, because I think the response is excellent and the answers to these questions, so well done. But I'd just like to ask you a question which came up last night at planning, Emma, where about this housing. I'm having a second bite of the cherry. Housing quality and standards. Kitchens for family accommodation. Now, in my mind, family accommodation is 2 and 3 bed, but I'm accepting it legally, it might be 3 bed. So what is the actual situation with separate kitchens? Because, as Clive said after last night, if you've got a kitchen in a family house, a 3 bed house, and it's in a main room, it's not a separate kitchen, and you've got children running about, and you've got all the smells and all that, you know. So, what is the legal position?
So basically, all of that is in the housing SPG. It's basically guidance, and I think I haven't had time to 100% check this since last night, but the way I understand it is that basically the idea is that people should have a choice. So that there should be a choice in the units. So it's not that they should always be a separate kitchen, but that people should have a choice. So I was actually thinking about this today. And I'm wondering if one of the things that we could do, which of course does also add delay into the planning process, which obviously is something the government really doesn't want to do, but one of the things that we could do is think about whether we could condition the layouts of the family units to be agreed at a later date, so that when they, when they know more about what they think the market is, or what the people that they want to sell to actually want, then we can actually go forward and approve those layouts. And I suppose I think it's difficult, because I totally accept that there are cultural reasons why and religious reasons why you aren't supposed to cook in the same place as your living area is. And I suppose there are health and safety reasons, but then I think there are also reasons and the way that people kind of quite like to live. And in essence, when you spend a lot of time in the kitchen cooking, if it's one room, then you're actually watching the kids while you're doing that, rather than them being off doing something else. And I have to say that I'm about to actually knock my kitchen through. And one of the things that we often find is that the kitchen is the tiniest room in my house, and everyone always piles into the kitchen when people are around, and we're all just standing in like this really tiny place. So I think we have to accept that people have different views about that, but I also understand what you're saying. So I'm trying to think about a way that we can kind of deal with everyone's choices, but it isn't a London Plan policy. It's guidance that there should be choice. But I'll get you something more on it, John, and I'll send you something through.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's more than just cultural reasons. Would you not agree, Emma, that that firstly, the most likely site for a fire to break out in a house is the kitchen, or the area of a kitchen, and if it is a separate kitchen with a closed door, that fire is going to spread less quickly than otherwise?
Well, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, because if you have a lounge and a kitchen that's through, then you will have a door to the lounge kitchen, so the fire wouldn't spread up the stairs if it was a house, or if it was a flat, it wouldn't spread into the rest of it. That is covered by building regulations.
Counter to that, you're also more likely to see a chip pan catching fire if you're in the same room. Do you know what I mean? So.
I'm not going to be tempted to discuss kitchens, but I have got a couple of things that I wanted to ask about. One's about small sites. I'm not clear whether the council is in favour or not in favour of small sites. Looking at the grid the table that you've provided and the handout, but I find the idea of small sites quite attractive to develop them, and I would like to know a bit more about whether the council has. I think Alan has mentioned another meeting somewhere. I think at last committee you made a passing reference to having some sites, thinking about sites. So I would like to know: do we have lists of sites available which would qualify as small sites? And are we has there been any thinking about how these could be brought forward in line with what looked to me to be like the Mayor's aspirations? And when we went to the GLA for the meeting on the social housing review, they talked a lot about, seem to be very keen on small sites, because they look to me like quick wins, So that's point number one. The second one was point D4 on page 37. Yeah.
So we're not saying that we don't support bringing forward development on small sites. We absolutely do. What we're saying is that we don't support there being a separate element to our housing target for small sites. And the reason behind that is basically that they often tend to be the hardest ones to actually get through. That's partly because they're often kind of design challenges with them. They're not brought forward by the larger developers, they're brought forward by smaller developers, so there's quite a lot more negotiation to do. And funnily enough, they're also the ones that are least likely to be implemented. So one of the problems with the raise in our housing target and with the element that's in there for the small sites is that we will be judged against our 5-year housing land supply, and Matt and I are concerned that we can't deliver this small sites element. If we don't have a 5-year housing land supply, then we get into the situation where there's effectively deemed planning permission on all of our sites that developers want to bring forward, because we haven't been able to deliver our housing targets. So that's a concern. I don't know if I think Alan and Fred were indicating that I think there's two different things here. Obviously, we have a small sites programme of bringing forward our own sites. And that's kind of an element of this small sites issue. But I don't know if you want to say anything, Alan or Fred.
We have on our small sites, our own small sites, and conversations with the GLA. I take fully on board what Emma was saying. I mean, small sites are very difficult to do. I think in a theoretical sense they seem very attractive, and they seem very helpful. But in terms of our own programme, we found it quite difficult and quite resource hungry. But one of the things we will be looking at doing is working with the GLA, because they seem to be keen to support us, to do design work, to do development work. We, as in terms of doing a development programme, we're actually looking at doing more medium-sized sites, because basically if we only have a finite number of staff, if they have to go on sites that are 2 and 3 units, we won't deliver the sort of numbers of houses that we want to, and I assume everyone else here wants us to. Yeah.
I would say currently we do in sort of natural development, we do about 200 units from small sites. The London plan's telling us now we've got a target of 626 units. So it's triple what we currently do. And that's going to be a really hard task for us. I mean, we naturally, and not only that, it's going to supersede some of the policies that we have in place now. We've got obviously the family housing protection zone that we've put in place to protect the larger existing stock of family homes. This policy will supersede that as well, and will allow for any of those to be converted. Yeah, the London Plan definition of a small site is anything below 0.25 of a hectare and 25 units.
So I'll have to sort of think about what you just said in relation to that. If I could go back to the small sites, the council owns lots of land. Well, that's our asset. That's what the row about the HDV has been about, is the fact we have land. We own land, a lot of those sites are empty, and those sites, presumably, you have a list of those sites, and you know the size of those sites, and the capacity, and what might or might not be possible. So if the Mayor is pushing for small sites, and the Mayor has funding, as I understood it, this was the other thing the GLA told us, they have funding which it appears local authorities haven't been too quick to apply for. There must be some sites, even with all the caveats that you have given us, where it would be good to go and for us to develop housing on those sites, whether it's done with a housing association or we do it directly. Hackney, I know, have had a competition. They used a competition to bring in. Well, my question is, why are we thinking about that and thinking ahead in order to do that, to build the housing? I mean, my own view is, I know the Mayor has targets. Aren't we more concerned with the housing that we build rather than actually having a target? You can meet a target and not house anybody in need.
Okay, we'll deal with the target, if you like. Yeah, we want to, and we ideally, if we can, identify a significant number of small sites to bring forward housing on. How we do that, it's going to be quite complicated for us. And you know, our site allocations is like this now, and that's for large sites with over 50 homes with them. We've got 119. To deliver, what is it, 6,500 homes, I'm going to have a huge table, if you like, of potential sites for allocation. But that's not to say we shouldn't do it, and we will. And part of that was looking at whether you could do it through the Brownfield Register, in particular, people putting forward small sites for us to consider. We haven't picked them up in the past, mainly because they're very, they've come forward naturally, and we consider them windfall kind of things. But I should say, the good thing about the small sites that the Mayor's put in is obviously we can require affordable housing contribution on those that are less than 10, is what he's saying as well.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So I suppose what I want to kind of get a better understanding of is, which I think you were alluding to, Zena, but I don't think you, I think you asked a few more questions after that, is obviously council owns land, and we know that, you know, the huge debate around 3 letters, but there's obviously land which is not existing estates. There's, I presume, land which is vacant, because I think one of the biggest controversies around those proposals was that it was on the existing, you know, sites with homes on it. What about land that we've got which is either vacant or not currently used as housing? What do we have a kind of a list? Yeah.
Yes, there is a list of potential sites we could develop. To go back to try and put these things together, we've had experience, or Haringey's had experience over the last few years of trying to do a small infill site development programme. It's been a very painful experience. We're sitting down and learned all the lessons from why that didn't work and didn't work well, why it took so long, cost so much and delivered so little. And yes, we have lots of little other small sites in council ownership we could build out. But we could spend the next 4 or 5 years, like the last 4 or 5 years, building 30 council homes on these little small sites and taking an enormous amount of officer time doing so. What would be much more effective to look at a smaller number of larger sites of 50 to 100 units, and there are larger sites across the borough of that size where we could actually put the same amount of effort in but get a lot more homes and a lot more council homes. And what we should be thinking perhaps on some of the smaller sites, fitting in with what the Mayor's proposals are, is actually he has set up, the GLA has set up, you can go on site and on their website and look at it, a portal for small builders to get small sites. At the moment it's populated with TfL sites across London, very small ones, and the idea is that the GLA will facilitate public sector putting the sites on, small builders coming in and building them out. And perhaps we should be thinking of some of these small sites, let's put them on that portal, take a capital receipt for them, and put that into a house building programme on some larger developments where we can get 50 to 100 units and deliver large numbers of homes. So we consolidate and get the money that way to do it. If we do it ourselves as a council, we can use our own right to buy receipts. We can't put it in the wholly owned company. We can spend it ourselves on building out our homes. So we have put some of our right to buy receipts into our own existing programme. And the advantage of talking about the GLA funding is up to this point for the last year or two, the GLA has only really been funding shared ownership. It ran out of money for funding its London Affordable Rent product very quickly. The government just today gave it £1.67 billion and included in the government statement that could fund some social rent. So hurrah, we might get some money from the GLA to fund that. Of course, the difficulty is you can't match right to buy funding with GLA funding, so we have to be quite clever how we use a bit of prestidigitation.
Sorry, I thought I'm loud enough, Clive. Yeah. It's all right, I don't need it on the webcam. So I suppose what I'm asking is, there are some boroughs who have high land values and who can sell a small piece of land and then match it with their right to buy receipts and build. I'm not saying they do it, but they could. You know, probably they don't do it enough. So could we consolidate our small sites, or some of them, match them with our right to buy receipts, and then build on bigger sites which would be more economical? And how many could we build on those bigger sites? I don't need you to tell me exactly where they are so that I can go and look at them. However, what I'm saying is, how many could we build on our bigger sites?
A couple of questions there. In terms of combining right to buy receipts with other funding, you can combine it with pretty much any other funding you have except for the GLA funding. So that's the only one that's excluded from it. So it can be Section 106 contributions. We have quite a significant amount of that to spend. It can be SIL if we choose to do that, but that's supposed to be used elsewhere. Any other money we have finding down the back of the sofa you can combine with it apart from GLA funding. But even GLA funding you can if you are a little bit clever with it, because you can put it in the same development but not in the same homes. So you need to identify it carefully and you can do it. So it's reasonably flexible. The key thing is if we're doing it ourselves we can. It's only when you've got a wholly owned company you can't put the right to buy receipts in. But we probably wouldn't be using, we wouldn't. with the wholly owned vehicle, you can absolutely borrow, yes. And we could borrow and build ourselves. And the likelihood at the moment is we'll put the majority of our right to buy receipts into the CBS anyway, so that's where we're thinking of putting that. We'd use other funding for these resources. And you're absolutely right, what you can do is, we do have some very nice little bits of infill sites across the west of the borough that have a high value, but are very difficult for us to build out. And that could actually cross-subsidise quite a significant council house building programme in the west and the east of the borough, where there are some very good sites. I would like to put a number on it, but it would be significant. You can move along a decimal point at least from the sort of numbers you delivered over the last 4 years if you would deliver a programme in each of the borough, with a significant amount of that being council housing. Yeah.
So it's not really about whether we support or we don't support them, it's about whether or not they are in line with policy. And the current London plan, and I think the new London plan, has, I think it's a 37 square metre standard for a one-bedroom unit where the shower is basically a walk-in shower, then there's no bathroom. So basically that's what the Mayor's decided is policy, and so therefore I couldn't recommend to you that we refuse planning permission for units that meet those standards. I think what this refers to, although I have to confess I didn't actually bring a copy of the plan with me, but I could look it up online, is that in the change that they've actually made to the plan, we just want them to provide more information and more clarity about what they actually mean, and it's also partly about this kind of new thing that they're promoting about collective living, and we just want to understand what the quality standards would be around that. But it might be that Alan knows more about this policy than I actually do currently.
Perish the thought that would be true. Can I just add one thing onto that? It's just the 37 square metre standard, which is, as Emma says, is in the London plan, so we can't deviate from that. It's actually a nationally prescribed standard now anyway, so the Mayor couldn't deviate from that either if he wanted to, which just attests to the success of Pocket in influencing national policy as well as regional policy, local policy.
I suppose my question isn't so much about refusing or approving planning permission, but it's about knowing what our levers are to kind of promote larger properties, because if there is a market for somebody to rent a box, you know, that's fine. That you can't refuse. You know, if that's approved policy and they want to live in that size property and pay X amount for it, then I think, you know, there's very little we can do about that. But I think my issue with it is its definition as affordability. Do we have any levers to say, well, actually, we don't define that as affordable, or is that tied in with the... because it's only affordable because it's smaller. It's not you're still getting the same amount of square footage per pound or whatever it is.
Well, that's arguable, and we could probably talk about that all evening. I think it might be better if we had this kind of debate at a later point. But I think that well, I mean, we obviously have to look at planning policy, and we have to look at what we can and can't recommend for approval within that. But that doesn't mean that we can't try and negotiate things and say that we'd rather that people didn't bring forward X, Y or Z. But if they insist on doing that, then we have to measure that against our planning policy, really. in relation to Pocket, under the current government, we're tied into that basically. No.
The interesting thing about the particular issue then, Emma's right, this is probably a debate for another time, but Pocket is very carefully designed, and national and regional planning policy is very carefully aligned to a line so it counts as affordable housing. And we can't outlaw it as affordable housing per se, but what you can do is apply those tests for affordable housing rather more rigorously than normally happens to Pocket to see that it is genuinely a discount to the market for homes at price. For although it may be 20% less than market price, it's 20% less than the average market size. You know, so actually it's generally affordable. So it's about... I thought... Yeah. It's right, absolutely. So there are okay, we should come back and revisit this because it's going to come through planning. It's going to come back for Cabinet as well for a decision on land disposal and discuss it then. So it's about applying the test, not just. But you can't just say it's not affordable per se. You have to say it's not affordable because it fails these elements of the test. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's affordable because it meets the policy. It is 20% of market. It's more of an issue that you don't end up with very many other units that are the same size that are market to compare the price to. That's more of an issue. But just for the record, the Pocket that we've got in Haringey, the way that we've negotiated the 106 is actually better than other boroughs have. And I'm sure we can have a debate another day about whether it was something that we want to carry on going forward with or not, but it is planning policy. And also, just to correct something else, something that Alan said earlier, you can't use community infrastructure levy funding for affordable housing.
Yeah, just wanted to go back to the issue around land and sites. So let's say we thought it was a good idea to divest ourselves of this multiplicity of little sites that we can't do much with, but didn't want to reduce the amount of land we own. So would it be a viable way forward to sell off all these little bits here and there and buy one or two larger sites at market price with that we could then build on? Second question.
Can you answer that one first,
yeah,
and then
sure.
I'll come back to you?
Yep.
The simple answer on that would be yes. If we put all our sites together, got planning permission on them, and increased the value, sold them, and then went to the market and bought land of a bigger size without planning permission, and then put the value in by developing it. So the answer is yes.
On that, the answer is absolutely yes. You're right, you could do that, but if you sell off a number of small sites, not saying you should, it's an option the new administration can look at, then you'll have a capital asset and you can choose what to do with it. You may choose to buy more land with it, you may choose to use that to build on the existing land you have, and it's your choice what you wish to do with that capital.
And your next question?
My next question, go back to the GLA and TfL. Do we have a map of the land that they own in our borough, and do we have an indication of whether we might be in a position to acquire or get hold of some of that land so that we could potentially build on it?
So, just to follow up on that, I've heard of like some talk about, you know, it's a good idea to build near railway lines, for example, because there's lots of vacant land there.
Yeah, we've got a map of all public land within the borough. TfL, of course, will not sell it to us. They want to develop it themselves. They've got a program to develop their land to realise £1 billion worth of capital. So I'm assuming every other public entity that owns land in the borough has this exact same.
The changes in the London plan, the new London plan, is it assumed that as this is now in process, this becomes the plan to which you work? And if so, how would that impact on Love Lane and the proposed developments there?
It's currently in draft, so it's not planning policy as yet. It still requires to go through an examination in public. You could consider it a material consideration, but it's up to the decision maker what weight they would give, and you'd need to be very careful there, because obviously if it got legally challenged at some point in time and you based your decision on it and the policy changed as a result of the examination, you'd be up for legal costs.
Are you saying, for example, Love Lane, where nothing has been demolished yet and where it's all still in some sort of process, the changes in the London plan, pushing up the levels of affordable, and I'm just looking here, this made me think of the question, policy H10, redevelopment of existing housing and estate regeneration. The Mayor is proposing changes to that in the London plan. Can't say I've quite grasped all of them, but I think generally it's more about more affordable, and you've got to replace and all of that. So given all of those things, it may not apply, but Love Lane is a project which is still in process. It's not all sorted out. I just don't think it is. Would it be affected by the conditions of the new London plan? Is where the question I'm really asking, and that might impact on how it all works, wouldn't it?
Well, legally, you have to, from a planning policy perspective, it's the adopted plan. So that's the only policies that you could apply as and when an application came in. Yeah, the current plan. So as until such time as it's adopted, and then it becomes policy. But certainly, that's not to say people shouldn't look forward to that coming in and take a position if they haven't got a planning application in at the moment. You'll have to take a consideration of what could be the potential policy position on those sites, and you'd have to think about that.
Yeah, so the policy, so as a policy goes through the process like that, it gains weight as it goes forward, but it doesn't get its full weight until you've adopted it, and it doesn't really gain a lot of weight until you've actually got the inspector's report into the plan. So that's kind of where we are with it.
It's one of those things that sort of give a lot of work to very highly paid lawyers and QCs to judge the degree of materiality it has as it passes through the process. And so and Dan have worked on previous London plans and seen it grow weight as I did when it's being written. The other issue to take into account, though, which will bite more quickly, is the Mayor's published his estate regeneration guidance finally, and consulting on ballots, and he says he will apply that almost immediately to any funding decisions that are made. So if you look for funding for any of these schemes now, then the Mayor will apply that almost instantly. That doesn't have to wait to get materiality. That can happen straight away. So this new 1.6 billion he's got for funding, if you wanted to acquire that for any estate regeneration scheme, he will apply the new guidance in his estate regeneration guidance, he said.
Where Love Lane has got housing zone grant of 70 million, well, certainly between 60 and 70, would all these rules now apply since the Mayor has given, I'm not sure if it's a housing zone loan or a housing zone grant, they've got loads and loads of DOSH, so from the GLA. So would all the rules, once the estate regeneration guidance is in place, would that all apply with the ballots?
Short answer is we don't know, because we're still waiting to hear from them exactly, as it were, for schemes that are kind of through the process. So, for example, at Love Lane, it's true that there isn't a planning consent, but we have the kind of formal decant process is now quite well underway, so it's kind of mid-process, and we're waiting for clarity from the GLA on exactly kind of where is the point in which they would expect existing schemes to sign up to it. So that we're waiting for that.
Another question in relation to that, because I understand at Love Lane you've got leaseholders, about 70, 60-odd leaseholders, and there are about, I don't know, John knows exactly, because still some secure tenants, and then you are now letting it to people in temporary. So if there were to be a ballot, if it were that the Mayor's rules applied, would the people who live in temporary have a vote?
As currently drafted, I mean, he's consulting on the ballots element at the moment, and as currently drafted, the proposal is that people in TA I think there are certain kind of restrictions around it, but in principle, yes, the people in the TA in this state would have a vote. Of course, with Love Lane is a kind of good example of kind of testing that, because, as you say, as the secure council tenants are rehoused over a period of time, which is the process we're in, then the ratio of secure tenants to temporary accommodation tenants kind of does that. And so you potentially end up in a situation where the majority of people voting in the ballot are people in temporary accommodation. And one of the issues for the Mayor to consider in his consultation is that the intention of the way that he's proposing his system work. And I just think, all of that is a very long way of saying we don't quite know where this is going to end up, either specifically for Love Lane or in general in terms of what will come out from the GLA after the Mayor's finished consulting on his policy.
Okay, that moves us quickly, because I want to finish this meeting ASAP, to update on our social housing scrutiny report. I know the panel members have been sent a copy of that earlier in the week. Have you all managed to have a look at it yet? Not yet. You need feedback by Friday, don't you?
Yeah, just to say that as it's going to Overview and Scrutiny Committee on the 26th, the agenda for which has been published on Friday. So if you could feed your comments back by Friday, it would be gratefully received. Thank you.
And work programme update.
Yeah, this is just a quick item. The work programme is attached to the pack, and I guess it was just for the panel to consider if there's anything that they would like to recommend to Overview and Scrutiny Committee for items that should be rolled forward to the next administration, or something for the next administration to consider.
People could have a think about that maybe and come back to us. Yeah, that's it. It's 9 minutes past 10.